This is what could happen if we don't slow down the pace of global warming. Already, there are signs. Animal species are on the move, some wreaking havoc on ecosystems. Rising sea levels threaten tens of millions of human lives. But there's a scientific revolution underway to combat climate change. Technology is moving fast. But can it outpace a warming world? The Earth's climate has always changed, but rarely this fast. In just 250 years, the planet has warmed by almost 1 degree Celsius. Celsius is a scale that scientists use to measure temperature. At the current pace of warming, most climate scientists agree we'll be about 2 degrees hotter in 50 years and at least 3 degrees hotter by the end of the century. What will our world look like at each of these stages? And what scientific and technological advances are currently in progress to address each of these thresholds? We know what's causing the problem. Greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide, which act like a blanket around our planet, trapping in heat. And greenhouse gases are increasing faster than ever. Evidence for this comes from projects like this one, just 1,000 kilometres from the South Pole. Antarctic ice built up in layers over millions of years. British climate experts read the past by drilling out and examining ice samples, or cores. This ice core is 750,000 years long.
If we go back 750,000 years, we can see 8 climate cycles. So that's 8 times we've gone in and out of an ice age. So if we look at those 8 climate cycles, we can see what the temperature was doing. But critically also, we can get at the carbon dioxide, the methane, these 2 greenhouse gases. We can see what levels they were in the ice. And what we find is they're actually remarkably consistent with temperature. They track temperature extremely well.
Robert Mulvaney is a paleoclimatologist, one of the world's leading experts in the field. He's examining a shorter or younger ice core. Trapped inside 18th century air from before the Industrial Revolution.
What I'm going to just do is just take my gloves off and warm it up, because once I've warmed it up, you ought to be able to see the air bubbles in the ice. So about 10% of the volume of the ice core is air. I can hear it crackling away as these little tiny air bubbles that are under pressure because they're from deep in the ice sheet are all bursting as the ice melts around them.
No matter where carbon dioxide is released, it disperses evenly in the upper atmosphere. So air over the Antarctic has the same CO2 concentrations as the air anywhere else in the world.
So this is pre-industrial air, and what we're hoping to see is what the level of carbon dioxide is in the air before man started using vast amounts of fossil fuels and pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Wait for the instrument to stabilise. So I've got 288 parts per million.
Today's levels of carbon dioxide are 386 parts per million. So there's been an increase of 100 parts per million in less than 250 years.
It might not sound a big leap, 100 parts per million, but we're 100 parts per million higher than we've ever been over the last 750,000 years, and it's going up 2 parts per million every year, relentlessly. Unless we can slow down the amount of carbon dioxide we pour into the atmosphere, that level will continue to rise, and it will have consequences on the climate.
Concern over climate change led the United Nations to set up the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. a group representing the findings of over 4,000 climate scientists. At its head, Dr. Rajendra Pachauri.
The science related to climate change has reached a level of sophistication and reliability which leaves absolutely no scope for doubt that human beings are impacting on the climate of this Earth.
Already, at nearly 1 degree warmer, we're seeing small but significant impacts on the natural world. As not only air but ocean temperatures rise, many marine species are shifting their ranges, moving out from the equator towards the poles. Tierney Tees, a marine biologist working with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, is studying this phenomenon. Tierney's research is focused on one of the strangest fishes in the sea. The mola, or sunfish, is the heaviest bony fish in the ocean, growing up to 12 feet long.
It looks as if it didn't get quite finished. Some people think that it's had its tail bitten off. Why would you design a big open ocean fish with no tail?
Molas used to be a rarity in the cold waters of places like northern California, southern England and even Alaska. But now they're being seen more frequently. To find out how far their range is shifting, Tierney has been tagging mola to record their movements.
And stop.
You have to sneak up on them because some molas are very skittish and others will just let you sidle up to them.
There we go.
The secret is to push the tag in to an area of the mola where we know it won't pull out. And that's right below the dorsal fin.
Nice. Good stick.
Once attached, the tag stays on for 9 months.
It essentially records the entire animal's travel diary. And then at a pre-programmed time, it releases from the animal, the tag floats to the surface and uploads all its data to satellite. That satellite relays it down to our computers. And from there, we can analyze all that data.
1, 2, 3, I'll push down.
Tierney's research is in its early stages, but a clear picture of the mola's new range is starting to emerge. And what's clear is that even with a small rise in temperature, the mola is on the move.
Climate change is much more than, oh, it's a little hot in the ocean. Because adding that amount of heat, 1 degree, you're changing all manner of things. You can change the oxygen levels, you can change the nutrient levels, you can change circulation patterns. Climate change is changing a whole bunch of things simultaneously.
Because of global warming, average temperature lines are moving out from the equator at the rate of about 64 kilometres per decade.
If that rate continues or increases, it will cause many species to go extinct because they can't keep up with that rate of change. And in turn, because species depend upon each other, you have the danger of ecosystem collapse.
And ecosystem collapse is exactly what's happening in the pine forests of British Columbia. Trees are being devoured by a beetle that was once kept in check by winter temperatures. A less than 1 degree rise in temperature has allowed the mountain pine beetle to flourish, decimating the forest. Bill Wilson heads up pine beetle research for the Canadian Forest Service.
It's emotionally overwhelming. When you see red pine trees, it's not a sign of the fall and the winter season. It's a sign of death. Those trees have been killed by the mountain pine beetle.
This beetle is responsible for the largest insect infestation in North American history. In the past 10 years, the pine beetle has destroyed about 13.5 million hectares of forest. That's an area the size of Greece.
What I'm looking at here is a lodgepole pine that's been mass attacked by mountain pine beetle. What they do is the females that successfully attack the tree excrete a pheromone, and the pheromone attracts large numbers of other beetles. Very quickly, the trees are overwhelmed. Once the beetle successfully gets under the bark, what it does is it will start to feed on the tree, and then it'll lay eggs. Those eggs hatch typically within 7 to 10 days, and the larvae start feeding immediately.
They weaken the tree and disease sets in. The outbreak can't be controlled with insecticides, so at the current rate of destruction, 3/4 of the mature pine in British Columbia will be gone by 2019.
It does give one pause to think that an insect the size of a grain of rice can cause the kind of damage that this is causing in North American forests.
The attack of the pine beetle is just one of many ways that a rise of almost 1 degree is affecting the delicate balance of nature and threatening the survival of species. The pika, native to the U.S.A. for over 40,000 years, could be the first mammal to become extinct as it struggles to adjust to climate change. In Africa, the annual migration of over 1 million wildebeest is under threat as drought destroys the grasslands on which they feed. In Central and Southern American tropical forests, 70 species of harlequin frogs have already become extinct as climate change is allowing a lethal fungus to flourish in their midst. Across the world, coral reefs, home to 25% of all marine life, are dying as the oceans heat up, absorbing more carbon dioxide and growing increasingly acidic. But it's in the Arctic that the effects of global warming are most evident. This is the Northwest Passage, a frozen expanse of sea ice off the coast of northern Alaska. During the Age of Discovery, countless explorers tried to use this passage as a shortcut between Europe and Asia. They failed. The ice was too solid. But in 2007, something extraordinary happened. The Arctic sea ice broke up and melted at an unprecedented rate. There was 23% less than in any previous year recorded. The sea ice retreats every summer, but in 2007, so much disappeared that for the first time ever, large vessels could navigate through the Northwest Passage. If this rate of contraction were to continue, there would be no summer sea ice in the Arctic by 2020.
If we lose all of the sea ice and it doesn't reform, which is a possibility, you lose it at the end of the summer, and maybe so much solar energy has been absorbed by that water that the sea ice never reforms, then you're going to have major and essentially permanent changes in the climate in the Northern Hemisphere.
For 28 years, U.S. Geological Survey biologist Steve Amstrup has been spending his winters in the Alaskan Arctic collecting extensive data. He is studying one of the most magnificent animals on the planet. The polar bear is the largest carnivore on land. Superbly adapted to living in this unforgiving wilderness for the last 300,000 years, it cannot adapt to climate change. As one bear already has a number on its back, Steve knows it's been tagged and studied. Using a tranquilizer dart, he sedates the unmarked bear, a female.
What we're trying to do is to understand the welfare of the population and to look into the future to see what the future welfare of this population is likely to be.
Steve and his team have an hour to do a number of tests to assess the size, weight and health of the female before the sedation wears off.
Well, this is just to get different measurements, and this is a total girth. So it looks like 120.3. Yep.
The research has revealed that many polar bears are becoming malnourished.
Polar bears depend entirely for their nutrition on seals that they catch from the surface of this ice, and therefore they're entirely dependent on the sea ice for their survival. And our big concern right now is the sea ice in this part of the world has been declining at a rapid rate.
Steve has made a revealing discovery. This bear is producing milk, but her cubs are nowhere to be seen.
So what's happened is she's lost her cubs a while ago, and now she's in heat again. And so that means that she came out of a den someplace along the coast this spring, lost her cubs.
In recent years, Steve has seen a big fall in the number of cubs surviving their first year. And he blames the changes in sea ice. Because there's less of it and it's thinner, the ice forms more pressure ridges. Walls of jumbled ice which present formidable barriers.
If you're a tiny little cub, only about this big, it's pretty hard to negotiate those sorts of things. You're more vulnerable to being prey of another bear or getting injured or not being able to keep up with your mother when she's coming out of the den to try and find food.
Steve's findings have helped lead to the U.S. government classifying polar bears as a threatened species.
4:45. Our forecast suggests that polar bears could be gone from this region where we're standing right now within the next 50 years. I've been coming up here for 28 years, and I've always been able to count on finding polar bears. If I were to live to the day where I couldn't come up here and see polar bears, that would be pretty hard for me to take.
In spite of the way she looks, the bear, once fully awake, will make a complete recovery. The sea ice has declined because, while temperatures in the rest of the world have risen by nearly 1 degree, here they've risen by nearly 3 degrees.
We see a bigger response, more warming in the Arctic because of feedbacks, which are amplifying factors. Specifically, it's the albedo of the Earth's surface, which is the reflectivity. The amount of the sunlight that hits the surface and is reflected is larger if you have a white surface covered by snow or ice. So if that melts back, that exposes a darker surface which absorbs more sunlight, and that increases the warming and melts more ice. So you get a bigger change in the Arctic than on the global average.
The impact of rising temperatures in the Arctic is not only felt by the animals. Locked in by sea ice 9 months a year, Barter Island is home to around 300 people, mostly Inupiat. For countless generations, life here has revolved around hunting animals for survival. Robert Thompson is a local Inupiat hunter. Today he's heading out to what was once a bountiful hunting ground.
we're losing some of our mammals. We're going to be losing muskox. They'll probably be extinct in this area in my lifetime. The polar bear are going to be gone. The caribou are diminished, and some of the bird life. If we don't have our animals, we're gone. We're done as a people. Our culture is based on the animals. We might import different types of food and still live here, but the things that we do that define us are going to be gone.
By the middle of this century, most climate scientists believe we will be living in a 2-degree warmer world. The only way to avoid this is to curb our emissions and change the way we produce energy. Over a quarter of the greenhouse gases we produce come from fossil fuels burned to generate electricity. Coal, oil and natural gas power almost every aspect of our lives, and we show few signs of cutting back.
We will get global warming of at least 2 degrees Celsius if we continue even a small number of additional years at the rates we are changing now, because the expanding economies in the developing world are growing so rapidly and their CO2 emissions are growing so rapidly.
The fastest growth has been in China. It's recently overtaken the U.S. as the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. China builds 2 large coal-fired power stations every month. Coal powers much of the world's economic development and a staggering 41% of worldwide electricity generation. But now there's a remarkable technology that allows us to use coal without releasing CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, and it's already in use. This $2 billion power plant in Beulah, North Dakota, provides energy for 500,000 homes. Its fuel source is a local coal, and its pioneering technology is called carbon capture and storage, CCS. CCS is a 2-part process. The first part captures carbon dioxide at its source.
So inside this pipe is pure CO2. Prior to the year 2000, instead of putting it into this pipe, we were venting it into the air from that stack over there.
Floyd Robb works for the power company.
Any carbonated beverage has CO2 injected into it, and this bottle's been sitting in the sun so it's warm, and when you shake it up, it's under pressure. When I release that pressure, the CO2 flashes off. It's a very similar process that we use here at the gasification plant, only we use chilled methanol.
Methanol is a chemical compound which, at around minus 70 degrees Celsius, is very efficient at absorbing carbon dioxide. But when the methanol is warmed and depressurized, like the bottle of soda, it releases the CO2. It's then captured and compressed. But this is only the first stage of CCS. The real challenge is where to store the enormous quantities of carbon dioxide that plants like this will capture. The solution could be found here, in the magnificent sandstone canyons of Utah's appropriately named Carbon County. Brian McPherson, a geophysicist at the University of Utah, is heading up an $88 million government research project aimed at finding a way to safely store carbon dioxide. The most promising solution? Injecting it into sandstone.
Sandstone is a terrific storage medium because even though it looks solid, it's actually very porous. There's lots of pore space. In fact, 10 to 15% of The rock matrix itself is actually pore space that usually holds water or brine, and we're looking at injecting CO2, replacing that water or brine with CO2.
Brian's team plan to inject 1 million tons of CO2, the annual output of a small power plant, into rock formations several kilometers underground. In this canyon, those layers can be clearly seen.
The Navajo Formation, it's a massive sandstone layer. You can see it here as a sheer cliff face right behind me. Below the Navajo is the Kayenta Formation, a dark banded layer. And below the Kayenta is the Wingate Formation. The Wingate is our storage target at our test site. High porosity, high permeability, whereas the Kayenta above it is low porosity and low permeability. And the idea is that the Kayenta will prevent the CO2 from migrating towards the surface.
If their natural seals hold, the potential storage capacity of geological formations like sandstone is huge.
In the state of Utah, where we are now, we have at least 50 years of potential storage in geological formations, and that's a conservative estimate.
CCS could offer us the maximum benefit with minimum disruption.
The merits of CCS are that it allows us to use the largest source of fossil fuel energy that we have. So many countries are already using coal, and we've got to figure out some way to use coal without the damaging emissions. So we have to try that, and then that may give us time as we're developing cleaner energies on the long run.
But there's another hurdle. At current cost, CCS could add as much as 60% to utility bills. And government studies won't be finished for up to 10 years. Only after 2020 will large-scale CCS adaptation be considered. And that may be too late. If we don't stop the increase in overall global emissions by 2015, most experts agree a 2-degree warmer planet is inevitable. And that could make our climate even more unstable. One of the most significant consequences of climate change has been the increase in sea levels. They've risen more than 20 centimetres since the mid-19th century. In a 2-degree warmer world, they could be over 20 centimetres higher.
Water, like many other substances, expands when you heat it. And the fact that the surface layer of the ocean is warmer than it used to be means it's bigger than it used to be. And the only place the water can go is up. So sea level rises for that reason. The other reason sea level rises is when you melt ice that was sitting on the land and it flows into the ocean.
The warming and expanding oceans will have another consequence: extreme and destructive weather, which will become much more common. 2008 brought devastating hurricanes like Gustav and Ike. It's estimated that more than 100,000 people died in Burma as a result of Cyclone Nargis. No one can link these events directly to climate change, but many scientists believe that higher temperatures already are contributing to storm intensity.
Latent heat provides the fuel for storms. Thunderstorms, tornadoes, tropical storms, hurricanes. The energy comes from latent heat. So warmer ocean waters provide more fuel for the storm. So we expect the strongest storms will become stronger.
The destructive impact of this will be felt in unexpected places. New York, 8 million people. One of the biggest and richest cities in the world. New Yorkers like to think they've seen it all, but in a warmer future, they'll have to deal with the threat of regular and devastating floods. It's not that New York is immediately vulnerable to sea level rise. Seas would have to rise by over 6 meters to put Manhattan underwater. But in a 2-degree warmer world, New York City is far more likely to experience flooding from storm surge. That's because the city is vulnerable to hurricanes. The last big one was in 1938, when the so-called Long Island Express grazed Manhattan, striking 112 kilometers to the northeast. Over 600 people died. Hundreds of houses were washed into the sea. Today, that storm would be ranked as a Category 3. There are many earlier hurricane strikes in New York's history. Jeff Donnelly is a paleotempestologist, a scientist who studies ancient storms. Like climate scientists in Antarctica, he does this by digging down into history and taking core samples. Here, they're mud cores, and Jeff is looking for evidence of storm surge. The surge is like a tsunami, whipped up by high winds and the extremely low pressure in the eye of the hurricane. It's usually the most destructive element of a hurricane strike.
This gives us some sense for how often a place like New York City has been hit by big hurricanes in the past. It's basically like reading a book. We're just going back through time. And so we split these open, and you can see that this is the organic-rich sediment that's being deposited day in, day out. Occasionally, though, as we move further down the core, you've got these large sand layers that are deposited. And these sand layers are the result of storm surge overtopping the beach and washing sand into these ponds and marshes. This very large layer here dates to the 1938 hurricane in New England. These cores here are actually from very near New York City and was likely laid down by the 1821 hurricane in New York City. It's the last time New York City was impacted by an intense hurricane strike. It was probably the 1815 hurricane, probably 1675, 1635. And then prior to that, these are all prior to European settlement of eastern North America. So they're all undocumented hurricanes that go further back in time. So we know, direct hurricane strikes, intense hurricane strikes in New York are possible. They've occurred many times in the past, and they're going to occur again in the future.
Previously, in any given year, there was a 1 in 100 chance that a devastating 3-meter storm surge would hit. But in a 2-degree warmer world, these odds will change. Leading climate scientist Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig has done intensive modelling to predict storm surge flooding.
One part of the climate change projections that is virtually certain is that the sea levels will be higher. That provides the base from which coastal flooding occurs.
Even if the storms don't change, having those higher sea levels really allows the flooding to go inland further. That is the #1 vulnerability of lower Manhattan and many low-lying areas in the New York region.
With higher sea levels, storm surges that would have caused minor flooding in the past will become as destructive as the big once-in-a-century storms.
What our modeling shows is that this very intense 1 in 100-year storm could occur once in every 20 years.
In our children's lifetime, it is very likely that this catastrophic storm will occur.
In such a storm, the New York Stock Exchange, Wall Street, and all of lower Manhattan would be inundated. Swathes of the outer boroughs, Staten Island, Queens, Brooklyn, and parts of New Jersey would be swamped as well. There may be a way to prevent this. Douglas Hill is an engineer who's been thinking about how to protect New York. He and his colleagues at the Stony Brook Storm Surge Research Group have a plan.
Well, all of these waters in the inner city here could be protected if 3 storm surge barriers were placed in the waterways around New York. One here at the Narrows, where the Verrazano Bridge is located, one at the upper end of the East River, where it meets Long Island Sound, and one on the other side of Staten Island. These 3 would enclose this area and protect it from being flooded by a storm surge coming in from the ocean or from down through Long Island Sound.
Around the world, similar barriers have already been built. In London, the Thames Barrier, which admittedly spans a smaller width than the Verrazano Narrows, has been operational since 1982.
Judging by what the Thames Barrier cost to build, each of these would cost about 1.6 to 1.8 billion. The 3 of them would cost about $5 billion.
But plans for this kind of protection are barely on the drawing board. Even if they were built, barriers could only shield about half of the New York metropolitan area. But the city is beginning to figure out how to prepare for climate change. In other areas of the US and around the globe, solutions may not be so simple. Louisiana, Texas, North Carolina. Vast stretches of coastal wetlands that would be submerged if sea level rise projections hold. Miami will come under serious threat. Large parts of Florida's Everglades and their unique ecosystem could be lost forever. Some countries already live with the effects of sea level rise. The South Pacific island of Tuvalu already experiences regular flooding. Only a small further rise in sea level could wipe this nation off the map. Egypt's ancient city of Alexandria is under threat, as crumbling seawalls offer little resistance to the rising Mediterranean. Already seawater is pushing into the fertile Nile Delta, ruining wheat and date crops on which people depend. Bangladesh regularly suffers severe flooding and river erosion and is forecast to be devastated by climate change within 40 years. It's likely that 35 million Bangladeshis will become climate refugees. Famine, disease and political unrest would take hold.
The poorest people in the world are the ones who are going to be the worst sufferers. They're going to face a lot of danger in the nature of coastal flooding, storm surges, cyclones, all of which would have very harmful impacts.
While it's the developing world that will be most severely affected, climate change will have an impact on us all.
It's a myth that people in industrialized countries have so much technology and so much money will just adjust. We are vulnerable. Think about Hurricane Katrina, in which in the richest, most technologically capable country in the world, we basically suffered, as a result of Hurricane Katrina's impact on New Orleans, a complete collapse of civil society that we weren't able to restore for weeks and ultimately for months.
Even if we could find some way to build barriers against all this rising water, there's one effect of climate change that no barrier can resist: drought and the creeping spread of deserts.
I think the world at 2 degrees Celsius or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit above the temperature of a century ago will clearly be a much warmer world, a wetter world in many parts, but a drier world in others. It's a world where wildfires could well be an almost uncontrollable problem in parts of the world that have already been prone to wildfires.
Nowhere is this threat more obvious than in the U.S. state of California. In June 2008, it declared a statewide drought. Reservoirs were down to half capacity, which led to strict water management and water rationing. Much of California's water comes from the snow and ice in the Sierra Nevada. And this source is in decline. The most startling evidence of this is the melting of the mountain's glaciers. In 1885, the Dana Glacier was 75% larger than it is today. Climatologist Anthony Westerling from the University of California, Merced, has been observing the changes.
One of the reasons the Dana Glacier is so important is as a symbol of what's happening to snow and to ice in the Sierra Nevada and other mountain ranges around the world as a consequence of warmer temperatures. And just as a glacier holds water as ice from year to year, a big part of our water supply is stored as ice in the mountains each year in the snowpack and melts out in the late spring, early summer. We rely on that runoff for feeding our farms and cities.
Global warming has already brought earlier springs to the Sierra Nevada, and that's meant less time for winter snows to fall and build up, resulting in less water for California. Even with a temperature rise of almost a degree, glaciers are shrinking worldwide. As the Earth grows warmer, accelerating glacial melt will pose a grave threat to huge populations. The greatest fears centre on the Himalayas, which feed the Indian subcontinent's great rivers, the Indus and the Ganges.
There would be a very sharp reduction in flow of water in all the rivers that emanate from these large reservoirs of ice on the Himalayan range. Now, if that happens, it's going to affect 500 million people living on the subcontinent and about 250 million people living in China.
With a 2-degree temperature rise, water shortages will affect not only drinking supplies, but agriculture. Dust bowls could replace farmland all over the world. And drought has another devastating consequence: fire. New research reveals that as the world grows warmer, fire seasons are going to get a lot worse. The California wildfires in the summer of 2008 were the worst in recorded history.
This is our nightmare.
I'm just scared. My kids and my grandkids, I'm just scared.
It's just unbelievable what it's like when you see all those flames coming right at you.
There were nearly 10,000 of them, burning over 5,000 square kilometres. 1,500 homes were lost. Some fires were still burning at the end of November. One fire struck here, in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. But what happened in 2008 was not an isolated event. Anthony Westerling's research has revealed an alarming trend.
There has been a tremendous and dramatic increase in the length of the fire season in the western United States, well over 2 months in duration.
It's not only the U.S. that will suffer more frequent and intense wildfires. It's going to be a major problem for Australia, Russia, South Africa, and the parts of Europe that will be more vulnerable to drought and heat waves. In a 2-degree warmer world, the Sahara will effectively be moving northward.
That's associated with an extension of something called the Hadley cell, which is where air rises on the equator, where the heating from the sun's strongest, and moves outwards and descends over regions like, currently regions like the Sahara Desert. In descending, it dries the air, and you end up with no rain, and you end up with a desert. Under global warming, this cell becomes fatter, and it tends to descend further north in the northern hemisphere, and that's basically taken in the Mediterranean region.
Every year, millions of tourists flock to Mediterranean beaches. However, this will stop as temperatures continue to rise. Places which are now temptingly warm will become parched, barren and unbearably hot. Local economies will suffer as tourism declines. For other regions, this rise in temperature and desertification will become a matter of life or death.
A 2-degree increase in temperature can lead to water stress in several parts of the world. By 2020, in Africa alone, there'll be between 75 to 250 million people who would be affected by water stress as a result of climate change.
If we're to avoid the effects of a 2-degree hotter world, individual efforts to reduce emissions by conserving energy at home and at work will need to become second nature.
The most important single thing that human society can do to reduce its impacts on the global climate is increasing the efficiency with which we use energy. More efficient cars, more efficient airplanes, more efficient air conditioners, more efficient light bulbs, more efficient appliances, more efficient manufacturing processes. There is tremendous potential.
In the United Arab Emirates, work has started on a project to take energy efficiency to the next level, the eco-city of Masdar. It'll be completed by 2016, a vision of the future. 50,000 people will live and work here. The city will be powered by clean technologies, so it will be carbon neutral. There will be no cars in Masdar. Instead, its residents will get around in driverless pods. It may look like science fiction, but all the technologies planned here have already been developed. Masdar will bring them together and give us an early glimpse of how we may live in the future. One futuristic clean technology is already in use in Shanghai, China. This train has no engine at all, and no engine means potentially no greenhouse gas emissions. This is the first high-speed commercial maglev train in the world. It travels at 431 kilometers an hour. So the 30-kilometer journey from Shanghai airport to the city takes less than 8 minutes. Maglev is short for magnetic levitation. This train literally floats on air. Fan Mo is a director at the Chinese Maglev Research and Development Center.
Magnets fixed in the underside of the train force it into the air. Gravity tries to pull it back down. Together, these two forces keep the train levitating.
Once it's off the ground, another magnetic field in the track pulls the train along and slows it down.
The train has reduced friction, which means its efficiency is improved and it travels faster.
Maglev isn't a cheap technology because of the cost of laying the guide rail. Old train tracks would have to be replaced, but the benefits could be huge. The fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions is air transportation. Maglevs could offer an alternative to short-haul flights, which would completely change the face of travel across Europe, Asia and North America. But that won't happen right away. The Shanghai Maglev is quick and efficient, but not totally emissions-free. That's because the magnetic force that drives the train is powered by electricity, and here in Shanghai, that electricity is mainly generated by coal. So for this brilliant technology to really have an impact, we need either to perfect carbon capture and storage or come up with an alternative way of producing electricity. One country in the world has already done this by harnessing nature. 99.9% of Iceland's electricity is produced with no greenhouse gas emissions. Iceland's fortunate because it sits right on top of a geological cauldron. At the Blue Lagoon Health Spa near the capital Reykjavik, people are bathing in the same geothermal water that's used to generate their electricity. This health spa was traditionally filled with wastewater from the Svartsengi geothermal power station, which produces no greenhouse gases. Here, superheated water from deep underground emerges as steam, which drives electricity turbines. Geothermal power is readily available in places like Iceland, where there's a lot of volcanic activity. They've broken their dependence on fossil fuels for electricity. But not for cars. Iceland has more cars per person than almost any other country in the world. But it's pioneering a new technology that may make gas guzzlers a thing of the past.
This car looks like any other car. It's a typical look of a gasoline car or any car. But this is a hydrogen vehicle, which has a fuel cell technology.
Fuel cell technology is being pioneered by John Bjorn Skulason's company, which operate 13 prototype hydrogen cars. Under the hood, a fuel cell splits the hydrogen into protons and electrons, its basic subatomic components. The electrons travel through a circuit and are converted to electric power, driving the engine. In Iceland, they believe fuel cells are a big improvement on the conventional batteries that power existing electric cars.
The advantage of a hydrogen vehicle is we can refuel a hydrogen car in 3 to 4 minutes, and we'll have a similar range in a hydrogen vehicle as we have in gasoline. So the difference with battery cars is that they usually take 5 to 8 hours to refuel, and they have only half of the range of a hydrogen vehicle.
Reykjavik has its own hydrogen filling station. Here, hydrogen fuel is made by a machine called an electrolyzer. The basic raw material is water.
The unit is connected to water and electricity. The electrolyzer splits the water into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is evaporated into the atmosphere. Then we purify the hydrogen. The hydrogen goes into a compressor because the hydrogen has a much larger volume. So to have enough energy in a vehicle, we have to compress the hydrogen.
Once compressed, hydrogen can be pumped directly into the car, and the only emission is the liquid that went into the electrolyzer in the first place.
Just pure water. Excellent.
Hydrogen fuel is an exciting development, not least because you don't need to dig or drill for it. However, there are considerable hurdles to overcome. Currently, hydrogen fuel requires a lot of electricity to produce. So there's no net gain unless, as here in Iceland, the energy used to make it is emission-free. Iceland plans to be the first completely fossil fuel-free nation on Earth by 2050. But for other countries who don't lie on top of an endless supply of renewable energy, there's another source that's readily available to be harnessed: the sun. Now, in southern Spain, in the province of Granada, a breakthrough in green energy. A solar plant that works even when the sun doesn't shine. When it's finished, Andersol will cover 2 square kilometres and provide power for 50,000 homes. It's a huge step forward because a coal plant of similar output would emit 180,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. The plant's 210,000 mirrors are curved to focus on these tubes. The oil inside will get hot enough to drive steam turbines, creating electricity. The secret ingredient in Andersol is inside these tanks. Molten salt. Salt conducts and stores heat extremely well. Excess heat generated during the day is absorbed by the salt. At night, this stored heat generates steam to keep the turbines running. In the future, this kind of technology could really take off. Huge solar plants could be installed across dry, sunny expanses of North Africa, Texas, and the desert states. Vast areas, currently unsuitable for agriculture, could become ideal for power generation. Spain isn't the only country making huge strides in clean energy technologies. The UK is harnessing wind power by building the world's largest wind farm. With 271 turbines, the London array will generate enough power for 750,000 homes. The world's first ocean wave farm has been launched in Portugal. The Palamas uses the snake-like movements of its jointed sections to generate electricity, eventually enough for as many as 15,000 homes. In Thuru, near Malai in India, human excrement is being used to power the town's streetlights. Other Indian cities are considering it. In China, the Three Gorges Dam is the world's largest hydroelectric plant. It's designed to produce as much as 22 large coal-fired power stations. Though not a true renewable, and despite its controversial reputation, nuclear power is undergoing a resurgence. It currently provides France with 70% of its electricity, and several governments are planning a new generation of plants. All these technologies are a step in the right direction, but there's another source of greenhouse gases that's not yet been tackled. A source that produces even more than the transportation sector: livestock. The worldwide livestock industry is responsible for a staggering share of greenhouse gas emissions, 18%. That's more than what's spewed out by planes, ships and cars combined. That's because meat and dairy production need more and more land cleared for grazing, and a huge amount of energy is required to produce the animals' feed and refrigerate and transport the meat. The animals themselves are the source of one particularly harmful gas: methane. A mature lactating cow emits 105 gallons of methane a day. As a greenhouse gas, methane has more than 20 times the heat-trapping effect of carbon dioxide, so it's crucial to curb it. In a special airtight chamber, Christopher Reynolds from Britain's Reading University studies the animal's emissions in scientific detail.
The methane that's produced is a product of the fermentation of the cow's feed by microorganisms, methane-producing microbes in her stomach. And those microbes help to digest the feed that the cow consumes, but one of the byproducts is methane.
Contrary to popular belief, only 5% of methane is from a cow's rear end. The other 95% comes out of its mouth and nose. Reducing this source of greenhouse gas would be a major breakthrough.
One of the holy grails of people working in this area is to try to find a so-called green antibiotic, a plant bioactive compound that has antimicrobial action. In other words, it specifically targets the bugs that produce methane.
A methane-inhibiting treatment is only a partial solution. A much better way to reduce methane gases would be for everyone to give up meat. But as that's unlikely to happen, other ways to reduce livestock emissions are being developed. At the University of Western Australia in Perth, a strange creation is slowly growing in a lab. Oren Katz works in the Biological Sciences department. He's making some of the world's first artificial meat.
When we grow those cells, we actually tend to refer to them, we coin the term semi-living, because they're not fully alive, they're not an animal, but they are a living part of an animal sustained in an artificial environment.
This artificial meat was grown from the muscle cells of a lamb, but they could have been cells from any animal. They were cultured in a nutrient solution made up of blood plasma derived from cattle. The muscle cell cultures are grown in a microgravity bioreactor, which constantly rotates the meat so it grows in 3 dimensions. Without this motion, the meat would be flat, only a few cells thick. Oren is currently looking at ways of giving the meat more texture in order to mimic the real thing.
There is research which is being taken place at the moment in trying to find ways in which you can exercise those muscle cells so they would align and have a more of a muscle-like texture. And there's 2 ways that can be done. One is by electrically stimulating those cells, or the second way is to try and exercise them physically, trying to build tiny exercise machines, tiny gyms for those cells to grow and become more like muscle.
Oren has brought his unique piece of engineered meat to the UK, to one of the world's great chefs. With 3 Michelin stars, Heston Blumenthal is famous for fusing science and gastronomy. This meat is so cutting edge that in Britain it's not recognised as food and so can't legally be eaten.
It's got a smell of raw liver to it.
I never really sniffed it, but
I'm not allowed to eat it, so that's about as close as I can get. You're going to turn it into the world's most expensive, tiniest hamburger.
Yes, which it is at the moment, and that's as big as one can get at this stage.
Many people may find the notion of lab-grown meat less than appetising, but not this master chef.
I think as a catalyst for conversation, debate and thought, it's fantastic, because how many people are quite happy to eat sliced ham that actually is not ham at all, it's processed meat from animals that have been literally chained to the floor.
Yeah.
That's not a problem, but something that's been grown
in a
lab actually is a problem. To me, that has the potential to be a lot more ethical.
This technology is still in its infancy. Even when scientists figure out how to increase production, this lab-grown substance would only work as ground or mincemeat. Engineered steaks and chicken breasts are only in the dream stage. And none of it is economically viable to produce yet. Artificial meat may be decades away, but there is another revolutionary technology that also mimics nature, which could be ready in a few years. And it could actually reduce existing levels of carbon dioxide, vital in a 2-degree warmer world. It's an idea inspired by the world's forests. Trees absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. They play a critical role in controlling the planet's climate. So wouldn't large-scale reforestation offset global warming? It could, but there's a problem. We're running out of land. Forests are actually being chopped down or burned and turned into agricultural land at a rate of 356 square kilometres per day. But science may just have come up with an alternative.
What we call artificial trees are technologies for doing what trees do in respect to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Namely, they pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it in a form that will stay out of the atmosphere so that you don't get the warming effect of the CO2.
While renewable energies and technologies like carbon capture and storage focus on stopping the further release of CO2, artificial trees could actually reduce the amount that's already in the air. Two men may have just made a breakthrough in this scientific quest. Theoretical physicist Klaus Lackner and engineer Alan Wright. They first met here at Biosphere 2 in Arizona. Biosphere 2 was the largest completely airtight artificial ecosystem ever built. The perfect place to study how changes in carbon dioxide would affect the planet. When Alan and Klaus began working on how to make a viable synthetic tree, they knew it'd be a massive step in the fight against rising CO2 levels and global warming. The first device they built used sodium hydroxide, a chemical known for its ability to absorb carbon dioxide, but they immediately ran into problems.
The sodium hydroxide solution is a very nasty material to work with. It's very corrosive and caustic. As a potential technology candidate, it just didn't work.
So they went back to work and built this.
The breakthrough on the second device was that we abandoned liquid sodium hydroxide solutions as the way of collecting the carbon dioxide. Instead, we found a plastic which was able to collect the carbon dioxide directly when it's dry. It would pick up the CO2 just as fast as the sodium hydroxide.
This magic plastic has long been manufactured for its use in water softeners, but nobody had thought to use it for its natural ability to absorb carbon dioxide. The new prototype, more like a tall cabinet than a tree, was hung with sheets of the plastic. But for the plastic to be reusable, which is to say economically viable, they needed to find a way to make it give up the captured CO2. Another chemical, sodium carbonate, had properties that could wash the CO2 out of the plastic. But then the CO2 had to be extracted from the sodium carbonate solution, a process that required a lot of electricity.
If you were to use the electrochemical device as the way of recovering the CO2, and you would use a coal plant to make the electricity you use, you just barely break even with this device. So it was counterproductive to push into this direction. Frustrated,
Klaus and Alan decided to take a different approach to see if they could simplify the process. They went back to basics, using nothing more